What would you do if the world you knew cast you out? If the only people you had ever known turned their backs on you, declaring you unworthy, and banished you to the wilderness, with nothing but the clothes on your back and the ringing of their judgment in your ears? This was the fate of Sadie Pike, who at 19 years old was sent from the strict settlement of Bitter Creek to live or die in a desolate cave, a punishment for a crime she did not commit. But what her accusers saw as a tomb, the earth intended as a vault. What happened next in that lonely canyon would not only rewrite Sadie's future, but would forever change the destiny of the entire county. Settle in and stay close, and let us know where you're watching from tonight, as we tell this incredible story of resilience, discovery, and quiet vindication. The dust of Bitter Creek's single road still clung to the hem of her worn wool skirt, a final, gritty insult. Sadie Pike walked away without looking back. To turn her head would be to give them the satisfaction of seeing her tears, and she'd be damned if Preacher Theron Blackwood or his silent, obedient flock would ever see her cry again. Each step was a deliberate act of forgetting. Forgetting the pinched, pious faces in the meeting house. Forgetting the way Mrs. Gable, who had known her since she was a babe, had pulled her children close, as if Sadie were a contagion. Forgetting the cold finality in the preacher's voice, as he'd pointed a long, bony finger not at her, but toward the desolate hills to the west. The godless find their home amongst the rocks and the dust. He had thundered, his voice echoing in the unnaturally still air. Go, and may the stone be your only congregation. Beside her, a gray mule, named Jude, plodded onward, his own weary resignation, a perfect mirror of her own. Jude was a parting gift, or perhaps an act of penance, from Silas Croft, the blacksmith's boy. He had met her at the edge of the settlement lands, his face a mask of helpless anger. He'd pressed the lead rope into her hand, along with a heavy, well-oiled felling axe and a small sack of hardtack and salt pork. He's stubborn, but he's strong, Silas had murmured, his eyes fixed on the ground. Like you, Sadie. The words were the only kindness she had heard in a week, and they felt like a hot coal in her chest. She had simply nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Now, Jude's occasional snort was the only sound besides the crunch of her boots on the trail and the ceaseless whisper of the wind. Her crime had been one of compassion. She had spoken up for little Martha Prim, a girl of 10, who had been accused by the preacher of stealing an apple from the community stores. Sadie had seen the preacher's own son, Ezekiel, take the apple, and had said so, quietly and plainly. To question the preacher's son was to question the preacher. To question the preacher was to question God's chosen order in Bitter Creek. The accusation of theft was swiftly and conveniently transferred to her, twisted into a larger narrative of defiance and pride. She was, the preacher declared, a seed of rebellion in their righteous soil, and she had to be plucked out. So they had. Just like that. 19 years of life, of mending fences, of helping with the harvest, of singing hymns in a clear, true voice, erased in a single afternoon. She was an outcast. Her destination was a place spoken of only in whispers by the town's children, a dark maw in the side of Whisperwind Canyon, known simply as the Exile's Cave. It was where they sent people to be forgotten. As the sun began to dip below the jagged horizon, painting the sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple, Sadie saw it for the first time, a dark, gaping shadow on a distant hillside. It did not look like a shelter. It looked like a wound in the earth. Jude stopped, his ears twitching, and let out a low, mournful bray, as if he, too, understood that this was not a destination, but an endpoint. The last of the light had bled from the sky by the time Sadie and Jude reached the base of the hill. The entrance to the cave was larger than she'd imagined, a jagged mouth of gray limestone fringed with skeletal, wind-stunted junipers. A current of cold, damp air flowed from its depths, carrying a scent of wet stone and ancient stillness. It smelled like a place where things ended. This was her inheritance then. Not a parcel of land, not a family name, but a hollowed-out piece of nothing. Her punishment was not just exile from the community, but relegation to a place that felt like the earth's own tomb. She slid the meager sack of supplies from Jude's back, her movements stiff with cold and exhaustion. She didn't dare venture deep into the blackness, not yet. Instead, she found a relatively sheltered spot, just inside the entrance, a shallow alcove where the rock curved away from the prevailing wind. She tethered Jude nearby, his warm, solid presence, a small comfort against the encroaching dark. She built no fire. The wood was damp, and the thought of drawing unwanted attention, whether from animal or spirit, was too much to bear. She simply huddled into herself, pulling her thin shawl tighter, and ate a piece of dry hardtack that tasted like chalk and despair. The memory of Silas's face flickered behind her closed eyes, the way he couldn't meet her gaze, the shame and fury warring in his expression. The axe he'd given her lay beside her, its honed edge gleaming faintly in the starlight that reached the cave's mouth. It was a good axe, balanced and heavy, a tool for building, for clearing, for creating a life. He had given her a tool for a future, even as everyone else had sentenced her to a dead end. The irony was a bitter pill. What was there to build here? What could be cleared away except her own foolish hope? The rocks were unforgiving, the soil thin and poor. The cave was a gaping emptiness. As the night deepened, the silence of the canyon pressed in. It was a living thing, broken only by the cry of a distant coyote and the soft, rhythmic sound of Jude chewing his cud. Every creak of cooling stone, every rustle of unseen life, sent a tremor of fear through her. This was what they wanted, for her to be alone, afraid, and consumed by the vast, indifferent wilderness. She thought of the warm, cramped houses of Bitter Creek, of the smell of baking bread and wood smoke, of the low murmur of evening prayers. It all felt a lifetime away. Here, there were no prayers. There was only the cold, impartial stone at her back, and the infinite, star-dusted dark before her. She had been given a cave to be forgotten in, a hollow place for a hollowed-out girl. What would you do with such an inheritance? Would you see it as a prison, a final judgment on your worth? Or is it possible that the places the world deems worthless are precisely where true value lies hidden? What secret was waiting for Sadie inside this cold, dark stone? Let us know what you would have done in the comments below. And be sure to subscribe for more stories of forgotten history and incredible perseverance. For Sadie, the night was long, and the dawn would bring not answers, but the beginning of the hardest work of her life. The first week was a blur of survival. Each sunrise was a small, grudging victory against the cold and the gnawing loneliness. Sadie's waking thoughts were consumed by the immediate and the essential: water, food, shelter. The hardtack and salt pork would not last forever. Her first task was to secure a source of water, and it was in this search that the cave offered its first, small mercy. Deep within its second chamber, far from the entrance, she found it. A steady, patient drip of water, seeping from a fissure in the ceiling, collecting in a shallow, basin-like stone on the floor. The water was icy cold, and tasted of minerals, but it was clean and constant. She would not die of thirst. This small discovery felt monumental, the first sign that this place might not be actively trying to kill her. It was merely indifferent, and in that indifference, there was a sliver of room to live. But the memory of Bitter Creek was a constant, unwelcome companion. In the quiet moments, the faces would return. She saw Preacher Blackwood, his face a mask of righteous certainty, his voice booming across the assembled townspeople. She has chosen the path of pride and contention. She has set her heart against the simple truth. Therefore, let her find her company with the unfeeling stone and the howling wind. Let the rocks be her congregation and the dust her daily bread. His words were meant to be a curse, a final, damning verdict. The townspeople had absorbed his judgment, their faces closing like doors, one by one. They had whispered as she passed, their words like stinging insects, defiant, proud, a fool to cross the preacher. The most cutting memory, however, was not of the preacher's bombast, but of a quiet encounter at the very edge of the settlement's land. As she had guided Jude onto the path leading west, she had passed the small, secluded cabin of Ilara, an old woman who kept to herself, a midwife and herbalist the town tolerated for her skills, but distrusted for her independence. Ilara had been waiting by her fence line, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes dark and knowing. She hadn't offered pity or condolences. Instead, she had held out a gnarled hand and pressed a small, smooth, dark stone into Sadie's palm. "They see a tomb," the old woman had rasped, her voice dry as autumn leaves. "But the stone remembers the fire. Listen for its warmth." Sadie had stared at the cryptic words, turning the cool stone over in her fingers. It felt inert, lifeless. Warmth? The only thing she felt from the rocks of this canyon was a deep, penetrating cold that seemed to seep into her very bones. She had thanked the old woman, confused, and moved on. Now, huddled in the mouth of the cave, Ilara's words echoed in her mind, nonsensical and frustrating. Listen for its warmth. It felt like another riddle in a world that had suddenly stopped making sense. What warmth could there be in this forsaken place? The memory faded, replaced again by the preacher's mocking benediction. Let the rocks be her congregation. He had meant it as the ultimate isolation, to be surrounded by a silent, dead audience. He wanted her to feel the crushing weight of her own insignificance against the unfeeling geology of the canyon. And for those first few days, his curse felt potent. The sheer rock faces of the canyon seemed to watch her, their silence a constant judgment. The cave itself felt like a vast, empty church, and she, its lone, heretical parishioner. The wind whistling through the cracks and fissures sounded like the disapproving whispers of a ghostly choir. But a curse is only as powerful as the belief you give it, and Sadie Pike's belief in Preacher Blackwood was turning to ash. Sadie's days fell into a rhythm, dictated by the sun and her own aching muscles. After securing the water source, she turned her attention to the cave itself, her fear of its depths slowly giving way to a pragmatic curiosity. With a torch made from a resinous pine branch, she began to explore. The cave was not a single chamber, but a network of them, branching off from the main opening like the hallways of a strange, subterranean house. The air grew stiller and warmer the deeper she went. In one of the smaller, drier chambers, she found evidence of past inhabitants, the charred remains of an ancient fire pit, and a handful of discarded flint points. She was not the first person to find shelter here. The knowledge was strangely comforting. It made the cave feel less like her personal prison and more like a timeless refuge, a place that had offered sanctuary long before Bitter Creek was ever a thought in a preacher's mind. She and Jude established their life in the large main chamber near the entrance. During the day, she would lead him down to a small, grassy patch in the valley to graze while she foraged for edible roots and late-season berries. She learned the landscape with an intimacy born of necessity. She learned which plants to avoid, where the rabbits made their runs, and how the light moved across the canyon walls, marking the passage of the hours. The cave became her partner, her silent collaborator in survival. She learned its acoustics, the way a footstep near the entrance would echo faintly in the deepest chamber. She learned its moods, the way the air would grow heavy and still before a storm. The initial feeling of being in a tomb began to fade, replaced by a sense of being held. The rock walls that had once felt like a cage now felt like a shield, protecting her from the biting wind and the lashing rains that swept through the canyon. One evening, as a thunderstorm raged outside, she sat just inside the entrance, watching the lightning illuminate the valley in stark, monochrome flashes. The thunder cracked and rolled, the sound so immense it seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountain. But inside the cave, the sound was muffled, distant. Jude stood calmly behind her, his ears relaxed. The storm was outside. They were inside, safe. For the first time since her banishment, a feeling other than fear or anger or grief surfaced. A quiet, profound sense of security. She was not a prisoner in a cave. She was a woman in a fortress. The stone was not her congregation. It was her walls, her roof, her foundation. She slept soundly that night, the storm a lullaby, the solid rock around her a steady embrace. The world had cast her out, but she was beginning to suspect that it had inadvertently sent her to the only place she could truly be safe. The place was no longer a symbol of her exile. It was becoming the first real home she had ever known, a home she would have to build with her own two hands. As autumn began its slow, inexorable slide toward winter, a new urgency took hold of Sadie. The cave offered shelter from the wind and rain, but the cold was a more insidious enemy. A fire at the mouth of the cave was inefficient, its heat swallowed by the vastness of the canyon. She needed walls. She needed a door. She needed a home that was more than just a hollow in the rock. The idea came to her one morning as she watched the sun strike the eastern face of the canyon. She would not live in the cave. She would build onto it. She would construct a small, sturdy cabin directly against the entrance, using the cave itself as the back wall and its natural draft as a perfect chimney for a hearth. It was an audacious plan for a 19-year-old girl with a single axe and a mule, but it took root in her mind and refused to be dislodged. The labor began. Using the axe Silas had given her, she started felling the lodgepole pines that grew in a thick stand on the north side of the valley. The work was brutal, relentless. Each swing of the axe sent a jarring shock up her arms. Her hands, already calloused, blistered and bled, then healed into thicker, tougher skin. She learned to read the grain of the wood, to make the precise, angled cuts that would bring a tree down exactly where she wanted it. Jude, patient and strong, became her partner. She would loop ropes around the felled logs, and he would lean into his harness, dragging them one by one across the valley floor and up the gentle slope to the cave. Days bled into weeks. The pile of logs grew steadily, and as she worked, her senses sharpened. She became attuned to the subtle life of the canyon in a way she never could have in the orderly, insular world of Bitter Creek. She noticed things. She noticed the way a particular hawk circled the same thermal every afternoon. She noticed the faint trail of a fox leading to its den among the rocks. And she noticed something about the cave itself, a small detail that refused to fit. The back wall of the main chamber, the very wall she planned to build her hearth against, was not uniform. Most of the cave was a rough, gray limestone, but a large section of this back wall was different. It was a darker, smoother stone, almost seamless, and it seemed to hold the day's warmth long after the sun had set. On frosty mornings, when the air was sharp and crystalline, she would sometimes see a faint vapor rising from its surface. It reminded her, with a jolt, of Alara's cryptic words, "Listen for its warmth." She began to pay closer attention. She would press her palm against it at different times of day. In the morning, it was cool to the touch, but by late afternoon, it radiated a gentle, persistent heat, as if there were a slow-burning fire deep within the mountain. The other walls were always cold, damp, but this one section, a space perhaps 10 feet wide and just as high, was alive with this strange, subtle warmth. She tried to reason it away, a trick of the air currents, a patch of denser rock holding the sun's heat, but the explanation felt thin, inadequate. The anomaly was too consistent, too localized. It was a question without an answer, a quiet mystery at the heart of her new home, and it hummed in the back of her mind as she continued her relentless work, stacking the logs that would soon become her walls. The cabin rose slowly, log by painstaking log. Sadie was not a carpenter, but she was a patient and observant learner. She had watched the men of Bitter Creek raise barns and houses, and she remembered the way they notched the logs to fit snugly together, the way they chinked the gaps with mud and moss to keep the wind out. Her work was rougher, less precise, but it was solid. She worked from dawn until her muscles screamed and the light failed, driven by the cold wind that carried the first hints of snow. Jude was her constant, silent companion. He would stand for hours, occasionally nudging her with his soft nose as if to offer encouragement. She talked to him constantly, her voice a low murmur that was quickly swallowed by the vastness of the canyon. She told him about her day, about the stubbornness of a particular log, about her growing unease over the strange, warm wall inside the cave. The wall continued to puzzle her. It was the centerpiece of her new home, the place where she would build her hearth. the source of warmth and life. But its strangeness was a dissonant note in the otherwise simple logic of her survival. One afternoon, while measuring the space for the hearth, she ran her hand over its smooth, dark surface. The fine, almost invisible cracks she had noticed before seemed to form a pattern, like a spider web or the delicate veining of a leaf. It was not the random, chaotic cracking of natural stone. It looked deliberate. Her plan required her to chip away some of the rock to create a flat base for the hearthstones she'd collected from the creek bed. She took up her pickaxe, the smaller, sharper head of it, a tool she'd found with the flint points in the back of the cave. She hesitated for a moment, feeling a strange reluctance to scar the unusual stone. But the need for a fire, for a defense against the coming winter, was greater than her curiosity. She swung the pickaxe. It struck the wall with a dull thud, unlike the sharp crack of striking limestone. A small, dinner plate-sized chunk of the dark outer rock flaked away and fell to the floor. Sadie knelt, her heart suddenly beating faster. Beneath the dull, dark exterior was not more of the same. It was something else entirely. A milky white stone, webbed with faint gray lines, gleamed in the dim light of the cave entrance. It was quartz, not limestone. A massive, solid wall of quartz, hidden just beneath a thin, brittle crust. She stared, her mind struggling to understand. Why would a vein of quartz this large be hidden? How had this thin outer layer formed? She reached out a trembling hand and touched the exposed surface. It was cool now, but she could still feel that faint, resonant warmth emanating from deep within. She took the pickaxe again, this time with more care, and chipped away another piece of the dark crust. More of the beautiful white stone was revealed, and then she saw it. A thin, brilliant yellow line, no thicker than a thread, running through the heart of the quartz. It wasn't a trick of the light. She scraped at it with her fingernail. It was soft, metallic, gold. The pickaxe fell from her numb fingers and clattered on the stone floor. Sadie scrambled closer, her breath catching in her throat. She used the smaller point of the tool to carefully flake away more of the dark outer shell. The single thread of gold became a network. It branched and spread, weaving through the milky quartz in a breathtaking, impossible pattern. It was as if someone had poured molten sunlight into the heart of the mountain. It wasn't just a seam or a vein. The entire wall, the 10-foot by 10-foot section that had puzzled her with its strange warmth and its patterned cracks, was a solid mass of gold-bearing quartz. The dark outer layer was a thin, natural patina, a crust of mineral deposit that had formed over millennia, perfectly concealing the treasure within. She sat back on her heels, the enormity of it washing over her. The laughter, the judgment, the exile, it all seemed to shrink, to become small and distant. Preacher Blackwood had banished her to a congregation of stone, mocking her with the promise of a cold and empty future. He had sent her to the most worthless, desolate place he could imagine, and in doing so, he had inadvertently led her to a fortune beyond his wildest, most covetous dreams. The warmth she had felt from the stone was not some geological anomaly. It was the faint, resonant energy of the earth itself, concentrated in this incredible formation. The stone remembers the fire. Elara's words came back to her, no longer a riddle, but a profound truth. This stone, this gold, was born of the earth's fire, a secret it had held for an eternity, waiting. She began to laugh, a sound that started as a choked sob and grew into a full-throated, joyous peal that echoed through the empty chambers of the cave. The rocks were her congregation, indeed, and they had just delivered a sermon of glorious, golden vindication. She was no longer Sadie Pike, the outcast. She was the keeper of the mountain's heart. Winter arrived not as a gentle dusting of snow, but as a furious, roaring blizzard that descended upon the canyon without warning. The sky turned a bruised, slate gray, and the wind howled like a hungry wolf, driving sheets of blinding snow before it. In a matter of hours, the landscape was transformed, its familiar contours buried beneath a deep, white blanket. But inside her small, sturdy cabin, Sadie was safe. The structure, built with aching muscles and stubborn determination, held firm against the gale. The mud and moss chinking kept the wind at bay, and the heavy plank door, fashioned from the thickest part of a pine trunk, was barred shut. Her hearth, built against the magnificent wall of quartz and gold, drew beautifully, its flames casting a warm, dancing light across the room. The stone itself seemed to amplify the heat, radiating a steady, comforting warmth that filled the small space. The golden veins in the quartz caught the firelight, glittering like a captured constellation. It was a sight so beautiful, it made her heart ache. She had food stored, wood stacked high, and fresh water from the spring inside the cave. She was prepared. She had built more than a shelter. She had built a sanctuary. Jude was comfortable in the back of the main chamber, shielded from the worst of the storm. For the first time, Sadie felt a sense of profound peace. Let the storm rage. Let the world outside freeze. Here, in her fortress of wood and stone, she was beholden to no one. On the second day of the blizzard, as the storm reached its peak, she heard a sound that did not belong. A frantic, muffled banging on her door, nearly lost in the shrieking of the wind. Her first instinct was fear. Who could possibly be out in this? A wild animal? Or perhaps someone from Bitter Creek, sent by the preacher to what? The thought died as the banging came again, accompanied by a faint, desperate cry. It was human. Without a second thought, she lifted the heavy wooden bar and pulled the door inward. A blast of snow and wind tore into the cabin, and a figure, completely covered in ice and snow, stumbled inside and collapsed onto the floor. Two more figures followed, a woman holding a small, bundled child, both of them sobbing with cold and exhaustion. The man on the floor pushed himself up. His face was gaunt, his beard caked with ice. "Please," he croaked, his voice raw. "Our wagon, broken axle, been walking for hours. Our boy, he's sick." Sadie shut the door, sealing them once more inside the warm, quiet space. She helped the man to his feet and guided the woman and child closer to the fire. The child, a boy of about 5, was pale and still, his breathing shallow, his face hot to the touch. Fever. She had seen it before. "My name is Thomas Miller," the man said, his eyes wide as he took in the impossible glittering wall behind the fire. "This is my wife, Elspeth, and our son, Daniel." He looked from the gold to Sadie's face, a mixture of awe and disbelief in his expression. But Sadie's attention was on the boy. She fetched a clean cloth and dipped it in cool water from the spring, gently placing it on his forehead. She remembered the remedies Elara had taught her, the herbs for fever and coughs. She had a small store of dried willow bark, a gift from the old woman. She brewed it into a bitter tea, coaxing the boy to drink a little. She wrapped him in her own warmest blankets and sat with him, murmuring softly. The Millers watched her, their exhaustion warring with their astonishment. They had stumbled through a frozen hell, certain they were going to die, only to be rescued by a young woman living alone in a cabin built into a cave of gold. It was a story no one would ever believe, but Sadie paid the gold no mind. The crisis was not about the wall. It was about the small, fragile life in her arms. She had chosen to build a home, and a home was not a vault for treasure. It was a place of shelter, of safety, of compassion, and she would not fail this test. For 2 days and nights, the blizzard raged on, and Sadie tended to the Miller family. She shared her food, her warmth, and her knowledge without hesitation. She sat with young Daniel, changing the cool cloths on his forehead, spooning broth and willow bark tea between his cracked lips. Thomas Miller, a carpenter by trade, watched her with a quiet, growing respect. He saw the solid, thoughtful construction of her cabin, the cleverness of its design, and the immense labor it must have represented. He also saw the kindness in her eyes, the gentle way she cared for his son. He and his wife Elspeth spoke little, conserving their energy, but their gratitude was a palpable presence in the small room. On the third morning, the wind finally died down, and the snow stopped. The world outside was a silent, pristine expanse of white. Daniel's fever had broken. He was weak, but his eyes were clear, and he was able to take a little food. Elspeth wept with relief, clutching Sadie's hand. "You saved him," she whispered. "You saved us all." Thomas stood and looked again at the wall behind the hearth, the firelight making the golden veins pulse with an inner life. "We saw the smoke from your chimney," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It was the only thing visible for miles. A miracle." He looked at Sadie. "What is this place?" Sadie simply shook her head. "It's my home," she replied. She did not tell them about Bitter Creek, about the preacher, about her banishment. Her past did not matter here. What mattered was the choice she had made when they knocked on her door. When the Millers were strong enough to travel, Thomas helped Sadie dig a path through the snow. He promised to send for his wagon and to repay her kindness. "We're headed to Dalton," he explained. "Not back east. We heard there's a future there." Before they left, he pressed a small, hand-carved wooden bird into her palm. "For Daniel," he said. "He'll never forget you. Neither will we." Sadie watched them go, 3 small figures walking into a vast, white world, until they disappeared over a ridge. The cabin felt quiet and empty after they left, but it also felt different, more solid, more real. The act of sheltering others had consecrated the space. It had been tested not just by the storm, but by a moral crisis, and it had held. She had been cast out for an act of compassion, and it was another act of compassion that had now solidified her place in this wilderness. She looked at the golden wall, its value suddenly seeming secondary. The true wealth of her home was not the metal hidden in the stone, but the warmth and safety it could offer to those lost in the storm. She had not just survived her exile, she had built a life worthy of the name. The story of the girl in the cave cabin spread through the town of Dalton like a wildfire in a dry season. Thomas Miller, a man known for his honesty and plain-spoken manner, told anyone who would listen about their miraculous rescue. He spoke of the blizzard, his son's fever, and the young woman who had taken them in without question, nursing the boy back to health with kindness and herbal remedies. And he spoke, in a hushed and reverent voice, of the cabin's back wall. "It wasn't just stone," he would say, his eyes still wide with the memory. "It was like the heart of the mountain was laid bare. White rock shot through with pure gold, glowing in the firelight. Most dismissed it as a fever dream, the tall tale of a man who had stared death in the face. But the story reached the ears of a man who did not dismiss it. Mr. Alistair Davies, a geologist and circuit assayer from the territorial capital. A quiet, scholarly man with gentle eyes and hands stained by chemicals and rock dust. Davies's profession was to separate fact from fiction. Intrigued by the earnestness of Miller's account, he bought a new map, provisioned his horse, and rode out in search of Whisperwind Canyon. He found Sadie chopping wood, the rhythmic thud of her axe the only sound in the crisp morning air. She was wary at first, her hand never straying far from the axe handle as he approached. But Davies dismounted and introduced himself with a calm and respectful demeanor that put her at ease. He explained that he had heard Mr. Miller's story, and, as a student of the Earth's secrets, he hoped she would permit him to see the remarkable stone formation. Seeing no harm in the quiet man, Sadie led him inside. Davies stood before the hearth for a long time, silent. He took a small magnifying glass from his waistcoat pocket and examined the wall, tracing the veins of gold with a careful finger. He tapped it gently with a small rock hammer, listening to the resonant pitch. Finally, he turned to Sadie, his expression one of profound, scholarly awe. "Young woman," he said, his voice soft, "do you have any idea what this is?" He explained that it was a lode deposit of extraordinary rarity and richness. The warmth she had felt was likely a subtle geothermal signature, and the gold was of the highest purity. "This isn't a strike, Miss Pike," he said, his voice filled with a quiet excitement. "This is a treasury, a king's ransom." He helped her understand what she needed to do. He explained the process of filing a claim, not in nearby Bitter Creek, but at the land office in Dalton, where the law was administered fairly. He drew up the claim papers himself, mapping the boundaries with precision, ensuring her rights were protected. He treated her not as an ignorant girl, but as the rightful steward of a geological marvel. With his quiet, professional confirmation, Sadie's world shifted on its axis. The news, now certified by an expert, electrified Dalton. Prospectors and merchants began to make the journey to Whisperwind Canyon, not as a rush of greedy men, but as a slow, respectful stream of people, drawn by the legend of the Cave Angel and her mountain of gold. They did not come to take, but to trade. They brought lumber, tools, flour, sugar, and fabrics, offering them in exchange for a chance to pan the creek that ran from Sadie's mountain, a creek she now allowed them to work for a small share. A community began to sprout in the valley below her cabin, a collection of tents and small, rough-hewn shacks that would soon be known as Pike's Hollow. It was a town founded not on a lawless rush, but on the quiet dignity and generosity of its matriarch. Inevitably, the news traveled the 20 miles back to Bitter Creek. It arrived as a rumor, then as a confirmed fact that struck the settlement like a bolt of lightning. Preacher Blackwood, when he heard it, reportedly went pale and locked himself in the meeting house for a full day. The congregation that had cast Sadie out now muttered amongst themselves, their piety curdling into a mixture of disbelief and envy. She had found her company with the unfeeling stone, just as he had commanded, and the stone had rewarded her with riches beyond their collective imagination. The preacher's curse had become the ultimate blessing, and his judgment was exposed for what it was, the hollow posturing of a small, cruel man. He was humbled, not by force or retort, but by the quiet, undeniable truth of Sadie's triumph. His power in Bitter Creek began to wane, his sermons on judgment sounding increasingly hollow in the face of God's apparent favor for the girl he had banished. Months turned into a year, and the golden hour sun of a late summer evening slanted across Whisperwind Canyon, now a place of life and purpose. Sadie Pike stood in the doorway of her cabin, which was no longer a simple shelter, but a solid, well-built home, expanded and improved with the help of Thomas Miller and other grateful carpenters. The single room now had two, with real glass in the windows that caught the evening light. Below, the settlement of Pike's Hollow was a warm, bustling community. The sounds of laughter, of a blacksmith's hammer, of children playing, drifted up the slope. It was a town built on a foundation of respect, a place where your worth was measured by the work of your hands and the kindness in your heart. Jude the mule stood beside her, his head resting on her shoulder, his soft breath warm against her neck. He was old now, his working days behind him, content to spend his time in the sun and her company. The mocking jeers and cold shoulders of Bitter Creek felt like a story from another person's life. She rarely thought of them anymore. Her world was here, in the canyon that had been her prison and became her sanctuary. Thomas Miller, now the mayor of the small but growing town, walked up the path to her cabin, carrying a newly finished rocking chair, its wood smooth and gleaming. "A gift," he said with a smile, "from all of us, for the town's founder." He set it on her porch, a place that now overlooked a thriving community. He gestured to the town below, the neat cabins, the general store, the livery stable. "It's amazing what you've built here, Sadie," he said, his voice full of sincere admiration. "What do you call this place? Your home, I mean. Does it have a name?" Sadie looked from the warm light spilling from her doorway to the valley filled with families she had given a chance. She looked at the dark, familiar opening of the cave, now a seamless part of her home, its entrance no longer a forbidding maw, but a welcoming threshold. She thought of the preacher's curse, the intended finality of her exile, and the simple, profound truth she had discovered. "They called it an exile," she said, her voice quiet but clear, carrying the weight of all she had endured and overcome. "I just learned it was a foundation. Thank you for staying with us to the end of this incredible journey." This has been a story about the quiet power of resilience, a reminder that the places and people the world casts aside often hold the most profound and unexpected value. If you were moved by Sadie Pike's story, please give this video a like and leave a comment below. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next tale of forgotten history. We'll see you again soon.